Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Hi, everyone.
Today we're taking a deep dive into H.R. McMaster's At War with Ourselves. Now, McMaster, as many of you will know, served as National Security Advisor under President Trump.
That's right. And his book gives this really interesting firsthand perspective on his time navigating that, well, let's say, complex administration.
Absolutely. And his background, military officer, historian.
Yeah.
It brings quite a unique lens to his observations, doesn't it?
It really does. So in this deep dive, we're going to explore the core themes running through his account. We'll pretty much follow the timeline of his experiences in the White House.
Right. To understand the challenges he faced, the insights he gained along the way.
Exactly.
So what are those core themes we'll be focusing on today?
Okay. Primarily, we'll be looking at the fundamental differences, incompatibilities maybe, between McMaster and President Trump, especially on things like allies, how to approach authoritarians, and the strategy in Afghanistan.
Big topics.
Huge. And then there's the internal dynamics. The competing agendas inside the White House, which he describes quite vividly. We'll also look at Trump's approach to foreign policy challenges, Russia, China, North Korea.
The big three, really.
Yeah. And finally, we'll talk about how and why McMaster eventually left the administration. Our mission isn't just to list events, but to really dig into the deeper implications of what he experienced.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. Let's jump right in then, to the beginning of McMaster's account. He talks about the initial contact, the interview at Mar-a-Lago. How did that all start?
It's fascinating, really. He recounts a pretty informal process, actually. First, he meets with Priebus, Bannon, and Kushner, kind of a preliminary chat.
The inner circle, sort of.
Right. And he notes Bannon seemed particularly interested in his military background. Then comes the meeting with President Trump himself.
And what was the focus there?
Afghanistan. A big chunk of their conversation was apparently about Afghanistan. McMaster gives this pretty blunt assessment. He basically characterized the 16-year effort as, well, repeating the same one-year war 16 times. Flawed strategies, he said. Not holding back.
Wow. Okay. And Trump's reaction to that kind of candor?
Well, despite that pretty critical take, Trump offered him the job right then and there.
Which is striking. So he accepts. What happens next? Straight into the fire.
Pretty much. He immediately starts meeting with key people at the National Security Council. John Eisenberg, the legal advisor, John Rader, policy advisor.
Laying the groundwork.
Exactly. And these early talks really highlighted some existing structural complexities, issues with how the NSC was set up, like Tom Bossert's role as Homeland Security advisor, and how that fit or didn't quite fit.
And legal compliance came up early, too.
Oh, yeah. Eisenberg really stressed the importance of operating within legal boundaries, which, becomes a recurring theme given all the controversies surrounding the administration later on.
McMaster also talks about his first presidential daily briefing, the PDB, with Trump and Mike Pompeo, who was CIA director then. Any insights from that?
Yeah. Pompeo apparently gave him some advice, keep it concise, focus on the essentials, maybe frame things in a narrative if possible.
Storytelling for the president.
Kind of. And he also warned McMaster that Trump often thinks unconventionally, throws ideas out there. McMaster quickly noticed this dynamic he calls competitive sycophancy.
Competitive sycophancy. Explain that.
It's basically advisors seeming to compete over who could agree most enthusiastically with whatever the president said, trying to curry favor, essentially.
He gives an example of this pretty early on, right? Something about recognizing a veteran during Trump's first speech to Congress.
Yes, that's a really telling incident. It kind of shows the maybe lack of thorough internal vetting sometimes. The proposal was to honor a veteran who was also a felon.
Oh. Right.
McMaster was apparently quite taken aback. He intervened directly, arguing, while it's important not to stigmatize veterans with mental health issues, holding up a felon wasn't the right way to represent the community. It could backfire.
So he pushed back.
He did. He appealed to what he saw as Trump's underlying intention to honor veterans positively. And reportedly, Priebus told Stephen Miller to find someone else. After that, McMaster also made it a point to meet with former NSAs.
Getting advice from the predecessors, like who?
People like Kissinger, Brzezinski, Scowcroft, Hadley, trying to get their perspectives on the role.
And then there was his decision to stay in uniform. That didn't seem to go down too well with Secretary Mattis initially.
Yeah, he describes Mattis's reaction as just a rather curt, okay, HR. Later, when they discussed the plan to defeat ISIS, McMaster found the draft. Well, Lacking.
Lacking how?
It didn't have a comprehensive strategy for what happens after the military wins. How do you get to a stable, long-term political settlement? That was missing, in his view.
So an early sign of maybe differing strategic views there.
Possibly, yeah. And staying in uniform might have signaled a certain independence, maybe a different approach than some civilian predecessors.
Early on, McMaster also reflects on the political divisions in America and his hope, maybe ambition, to forge a coherent foreign policy despite all that. He even compares Trump to LBJ.
He does, specifically regarding their interactions with the media and a tendency to belittle people they disagreed with.
What's the significance of that comparison, do you think?
Well, McMaster had written about LBJ before, how his advisors sometimes held back bad news. So drawing that parallel suggests McMaster was aware of that potential dynamic with Trump. Maybe he intended to avoid that pitfall, to tell Trump what he needed to hear, not just what he wanted to hear.
Makes sense. He also mentions getting advice from others, like John Poindexter warning about a chaotic first year.
Right. And while McMaster aimed to cooperate with cabinet secretaries like Mattis and Tillerson, he also notes Kissinger and Brzezinski warned him not to let state and defense dominate policymaking. Keep it in the NSC.
So conflicting advice right from the start.
Yeah.
A bit of a tightrope walk.
Definitely suggests a complex environment, competing interests, different philosophies on how the process should work.
And there was that early incident where Bannon and Priebus apparently tried to fire a bunch of NSC staff. How did McMaster handle that?
Yeah, he was surprised the acting NSA, General Kellogg, hadn't even told him about it. His response was quite characteristic, it seems.
What did you do?
He basically gathered the targeted staff, had a drink with them, and laid it out. He said, look, I won't tolerate disloyalty to the president, but just firing everyone wholesale, that's counterproductive.
Trying to stabilize things.
Exactly. Plus, he pointed out many were finishing their rotations anyway. His focus seemed to be keeping the staff functional, focused on supporting the president and the country. It also kind of highlights that sense of duty many felt, serving despite the internal turmoil.
So, stepping back, what did McMaster see as the biggest national security challenges right when he walked in the door? What needed immediate attention?
He quickly zeroed in on North Korea, China, and the ongoing threat from ISIS. Those were the big three demanding coherent strategies right away.
Okay. Let's move into the spring of 2017. His schedule sounds incredibly packed. Lots of international travel, major meetings, even while dealing with personal things like his daughter's wedding.
Yeah, the intensity of the job really comes through. He talks about holding key national security meetings while he was out in California for the wedding.
Like, who was he meeting with?
King Abdullah of Jordan, discussing Iran's influence, Syria. Also, President al-Sisi of Egypt, dealing with a hostage situation involving an American citizen.
Did that have an outcome?
It did. His personal involvement apparently helped contribute to that citizen's eventual release, so direct impact there.
And then April 2017, the chemical attack in Syria. That led to a U.S. strike. What does his account tell us about that?
To stop chemical weapons use from becoming, normalized. He describes his role in rallying international support and briefing the press.
So shaping the narrative around the strike.
Very much so. Framing it as necessary to uphold international norms, deter future attacks. He was actively involved in that process.
And right after that, the summit with China's President Xi at Mar-a-Lago. What was McMaster's main goal there?
His big concern was making sure President Trump didn't accidentally endorse China's concept of a new kind of major power relations.
Why was that phrase so problematic?
McMaster saw it as a strategic play by China to basically carve out its own sphere of influence, establish regional dominance, and push the U.S. out. So he focused on anticipating what Xi wanted to hear and guiding Trump's remarks away from anything that could be interpreted as agreement.
Did he feel he succeeded?
He seemed to think so, yeah. He felt they navigated that potential diplomatic minefield successfully. And interestingly, despite all the internal friction he often felt, he notes the NSC team actually worked pretty well together during both the Syria crisis and the China summit, though he kind of suspected that collaboration wouldn't last.
Then came his trip to Afghanistan and Pakistan. That sounds like it was particularly frustrating for him.
It really does. He paints a pretty bleak picture. In Afghanistan, it was the same old story. He felt requests for more money, but not enough real commitment to fighting corruption, which the Trump administration was losing patience with.
And Pakistan.
Same dynamic, different country. Promises to crack down on terrorist groups sheltering there, but mainly, in his view, in exchange for more aid. He called it serial gullibility on the U.S. part, something he wanted to break.
Did he try anything specific?
Yeah, he actually passed a handwritten note to Pakistan's army chief listing American and allied hostages being held by the Haqqani network, basically saying, we know.
Wow. Correct.
Very. And his talks during that trip, including one with Senator McCain, really highlight the huge challenges he was juggling, both overseas and back in the White House. He also had a tough video call with Afghan President Ghani about the worsening security situation.
And adding to all this were problems with policy coordination back in D.C. because of Tillerson's reorganization at the State Department.
Exactly. McMaster describes how the internal shakeup at State made it really hard for the NSC to even figure out who to talk to over there.
Just basic communication breakdown.
Pretty much. Lack of clear counterparts, ongoing reviews. It just made developing and implementing coherent policy much more difficult, a real bureaucratic hurdle.
Then came May 2017. Huge turmoil. Trump fires FBI Director Comey, and then almost immediately meets with the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and Ambassador Kislyak in the Oval Office. McMaster's take.
He expresses clear discomfort with that meeting, especially the timing, right after Comey's firing. And Trump apparently made comments about Comey and the Russia investigation during the meeting with the Russians.
Not ideal.
Definitely not. A period of intense turbulence, as he puts it. And oddly, or perhaps poignantly, he notes that same day was the anniversary of his mother's death, and he actually had lunch with Dr. Kissinger. A moment of personal reflection amidst all the political chaos.
Quite a contrast. The late spring and early summer then saw this whirlwind of international travel. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Italy, NATO, G7. Sounds exhausting just reading about it.
It does. The Saudi trip started with this huge, elaborate welcome, which Trump seemed to enjoy. McMaster talks about trying to keep him focused during the Riyadh summit on counter-extremism.
But did the enthusiasm last?
Apparently not. By the time they got to Israel and Italy, Trump seemed really tired, questioning why the trip was so long.
And the NATO summit was memorable.
Memorable for Trump's sharp criticism of allies overspending. Yeah. And he apparently walked out of a dinner meeting abruptly. The G7 summit in Sicily that followed was a bit more streamlined, perhaps less contentious. And through all this, McMaster was managing bilateral meetings, too, with India's Modi, South Korea's Moon.
Just constant motion. Moving into summer and fall 2017, tensions seem to ramp up again. North Korea is still a major issue, and then domestically, there's the reaction to Charlottesville.
Yeah, North Korea was a constant escalating crisis. Lots of engagement with South Korea, naturally. McMaster points to Trump's speech in Poland that summer as important, emphasizing transatlantic ties, warning Russia, things McMaster himself supported.
But internally, more drama.
Oh, yeah. You had the very short, very chaotic tenure of Anthony Scaramucci as communications director, followed by Steve Bannon's departure, really highlighting the internal power struggles.
And Charlottesville.
Trump's very fine people on both sides comments drew huge criticism. McMaster doesn't dwell on his personal reaction extensively in the book, but it certainly added to the fraught atmosphere. He then had that interview with Chuck Todd where he had to address whether he could even work with Bannon, who was still there at the time. Talk about awkward.
Underscoring those deep divisions, he also mentions a direct talk with Secretary Tillerson about his complaints regarding NSC processes. Constant friction, it seems.
It does. Tillerson apparently had a list of grievances. Information flow, predictability, White House implementation, even comments by other officials like Nikki Haley at the UN. McMaster tried to address them, sometimes pointing out the issues were maybe within Tillerson's own department.
Trying to keep the wheels on. Was the Camp David meeting on Afghanistan strategy a turning point?
It seemed important, yeah. It exposed Trump to a wider range of views, including directly from military officers who'd served there. That meeting ultimately led to Trump announcing the new South Asia strategy.
So despite all the internal static, some progress on strategy.
Yes. McMaster notes they made progress on key documents, like the National Security Strategy. He uses this phrase, friction in war, to describe the internal power games.
What's he mean by that? Friction in war.
It's a Clausewitz concept, basically. The idea that even the best plans face unpredictable obstacles, chaos, human factors. He's applying it to the White House. The internal fights, the competing agendas, that was the friction they had to constantly manage while trying to execute policy.
That makes sense. Then came the UN General Assembly, UNGA. Trump gave his principled realism speech.
Right, articulating the administration's approach. But McMaster's own meetings there, with Netanyahu, Macron, they revealed ongoing concerns from allies about, well, consistency and clarity in U.S. policy, especially on Iran and Syria.
Any other key meetings?
His meeting with Turkey's Erdogan was significant. Discussing Pastor Brunson's detention, Turkey wanting Gulen extradited, it foreshadowed future tensions, especially over Turkey's actions in Syria later. But overall, McMaster seemed to view UNGA Week as fairly productive, despite the undercurrents.
He also mentions talking with John Kelly, who was chief of staff by then, about how to manage Trump's contradictory instincts.
Yeah, basically saying it's tough to directly change his mind, highlighting the challenge Kelly faced. And then came the big Asian Odyssey trip in November 2017. Japan, South Korea, China.
Another long, intense trip.
Very. McMaster even anticipated Trump might get irritable because it was so long. There were discussions in South Korea about defense costs, a visit to a Samsung plant that highlighted the U.S. falling behind in chip manufacturing.
And China.
That was huge. McMaster actually passed a note to Kelly during the meetings expressing concern that President Xi was strategically outplaying Trump.
Oof, not good.
No, a worrying sign from the National Security Advisor.
Okay, so as 2017 ends, the focus shifts. Jerusalem and the national security strategy roll out.
Right. King Abdullah of Jordan visited just before Trump decided to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. McMaster knew Abdullah would be deeply disappointed.
Was there internal debate on that decision?
Oh, yes. The NSC meeting showed different views. Both Tillerson and Mattis apparently advised against the move, but Trump made the decision, so McMaster, despite his own reservations perhaps, worked to implement it.
And the national security strategy, what was the aim there?
It tried to bridge that gap between Trump's desire to pull back, America first, and the need to actually engage globally to advance U.S. interests. It stressed alliances, but also pushed allies to spend more, trying to reconcile conflicting impulses.
Moving to early 2018, this seems to be the beginning of the end for McMaster's tenure.
Yeah.
It starts with his statement on Russian election interference.
That seemed to be a key moment, yeah. His public, very clear statement at the Munich Security Conference acknowledging Russian interference, that likely accelerated his departure.
Why? Because Trump hated hearing it.
McMaster recognized Trump deeply resisted accepting Russia attacked the election, fearing it somehow delegitimized his win. So McMaster stating it so plainly created friction. Around the same time, he met with South Korea's NSA about Kim Jong-un's outreach, talked to the Japanese ambassador. Signs were pointing towards his exit.
Did you talk to Trump about it?
Eventually, yes. He told Trump directly he was ready to leave when the time came. Then there was that leak of briefing notes, the do not congratulate instruction for a call with Putin after his election win. That damaged trust further.
And Trump still wanted Putin at the White House, even after things like the Skripal poisoning.
Apparently so, which really highlighted the fundamental disagreement between him and McMaster on how to deal with Russia.
So the final call comes in March 2018. Trump replaces him with John Bolton.
Yeah, a brief phone call. Trump thanked him for his service, said they agreed on most things, which McMaster notes wasn't quite true. McMaster then told his wife, Katie, who was understandably relieved.
But he didn't just pack up and leave immediately.
No, even in those final weeks, he was still deeply involved. Dealing with the Turkish incursion in Syria, potential further chemical attacks there, the ongoing Qatar crisis, trade disputes over tariffs.
And the Skripal poisoning response.
Yeah.
That became the top priority.
It did, formulating a response to the nerve agent attack in the UK.
He talks about briefing Trump on options for responding to Skripal and Trump's skepticism towards the intelligence. Still tied to the Mueller probe anger.
It seems so. McMaster describes Trump's ingrained distrust of the intelligence community. McMaster pushed for a strong, unified response, expelling Russian diplomats.
Was the Allied response strong?
He notes some key European allies were actually less willing to expel diplomats than he'd hoped. A bit disappointing from his perspective. His final acts included meeting with Bolton to try and ensure a smooth handover.
And his final reflections in the book. Relief, gratitude, regret.
A mix of all three, it sounds like. Relief to be out of that pressure cooker, gratitude for the chance to serve, but also regret over certain things, perhaps policies not fully implemented or relationships strained. It clearly paints a picture of an incredibly demanding, complex, and often frustrating experience.
Absolutely. His account really lays bare the challenges of serving a president with such, let's say, distinctive and often contradictory views and instincts.
And the internal power struggles he describes, combined with navigating this incredibly complex global scene. It's quite a picture. You also feel the personal toll it took on him and his family.
So thinking about everything McMaster describes, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What qualities are truly essential for leadership in that kind of high-stakes, high-pressure environment?
That's a huge question. Resilience, integrity, strategic thinking, obviously, but also maybe incredible diplomatic skill just to navigate the internal dynamics.
And what about the long-term effects, the consequences of the internal conflicts he details, the foreign policy approaches taken during that time?
Hmm.
Where does that leave things?
Yeah, those are the big questions his account leaves you with.
Wow.
Definitely a lot to consider.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into H.R. McMaster's At War with Ourselves. We really encourage you, our listeners, to mull over these broader questions raised by his experiences.